Sold to a stranger to pay her father's gambling losses, she expected slavery. But what she found was a man who understood that some things can never be owned. This is the story of Lydia Brennan, whose father's greatest failure became her greatest fortune. Lydia Brennan stood in the cramped parlor of their Boston boarding house, watching her father pace back and forth like a caged animal. Patrick Brennan's hands shook as he ran them through his thinning hair, and his clothes bore the telltale signs of another sleepless night spent at the gambling tables. The smell of cheap whiskey and stale tobacco smoke clung to him like a shroud, and his bloodshot eyes darted nervously toward the window every time footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. "They'll be here soon," he muttered, more to himself than to his 22-year-old daughter. "God help us, they'll be here soon, and I don't have what they want." Lydia had been through the scene too many times before. Her father's gambling addiction had been spiraling out of control for years, each loss driving him to make increasingly desperate bets in a futile attempt to recoup his previous losses. What had started as harmless entertainment at the local pub had evolved into a compulsion that had cost them their family home, their savings, and finally their standing in Boston society. "How much this time, father?" Lydia asked quietly, though she dreaded the answer. Patrick stopped pacing and looked at his daughter with eyes filled with shame and desperation. $3,000, he whispered, plus interest. "Money I don't have, money I'll never have." The sum was staggering. Lydia earned perhaps $12 a week working at the textile mill, barely enough to keep them housed and fed in their single rented room. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million. It was completely beyond their reach. "Who did you borrow it from?" Lydia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Mickey O'Sullivan's operation," Patrick admitted, his voice breaking with shame. "You know what that means, Lydia. You know what happens to people who can't pay Mickey back." Lydia did know. Mickey O'Sullivan ran the most ruthless illegal gambling operation in Boston's Irish Quarter, and his methods for collecting debts were legendary for their brutality. Men who couldn't pay found themselves beaten within an inch of their lives, their families threatened, their livelihoods destroyed. Some simply disappeared entirely, their fate serving as a warning to others who might consider defaulting on their obligations. "There has to be something we can do," Lydia said, fighting to keep the desperation out of her own voice. "Some way to negotiate, some arrangement." "I tried. I begged, I pleaded, I offered to work for them for free. But Mickey's not interested in charity or payment plans. He wants his money, and he wants it today." A heavy knock at the door cut through their conversation like a knife. Both father and daughter froze, knowing that their time for discussion had run out. Patrick's creditors had arrived to collect what was owed, one way or another. The man who entered their room was not Mickey O'Sullivan himself, but one of his lieutenants, a cold-eyed enforcer named Seamus Kelly, who was known throughout the neighborhood for his efficiency in collecting debts. Behind him stood two other men whose bulk and scarred faces left no doubt about their profession. "Patrick Brennan," Kelly said without preamble, "you know why we're here." "I need more time," Patrick pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. "Just a few more weeks and I can—" "Time's up," Kelly interrupted. "Mickey's been patient enough. You've had 3 months to come up with the money, and you've got nothing to show for it but more excuses." Patrick fell to his knees, literally begging for mercy. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll work for Mickey for free. Mickey doesn't need another broken-down drunk on his payroll," Kelly said coldly. "But he did mention that you might have something else of value." Kelly's gaze moved from Patrick to Lydia, and she felt a chill of understanding wash over her. She had heard stories about men who paid their gambling debts by selling their daughters, but she had never imagined that her own father would sink to such depths. "No," she whispered, backing toward the window. "Father, no." But Patrick was already nodding eagerly, grasping at any solution that might save his life. "Yes, yes, Lydia. She's a good girl, a hard worker. She'd be worth more than the debt, surely." Kelly studied Lydia with the calculating gaze of someone appraising livestock. "She's pretty enough, and young. Mickey might be interested in making a deal." "What would you do if your own father tried to sell you to pay his gambling debts?
How would you fight for your freedom when the very person who should protect you is willing to sacrifice you? I won't do it, Lydia said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'm not property to be sold. Kelly smiled without warmth. That's not really your choice to make, girl. Your father owes a debt, and one way or another, it's going to be paid. But before the situation could escalate further, an unexpected voice spoke from the doorway. Perhaps there is another way to resolve this matter. Everyone turned to see a man unlike any Lydia had ever encountered. He was tall and powerfully built, with dark skin and weathered features that spoke of a life spent in harsh climates. His clothing was expensive but foreign. Furs and leather worked with intricate patterns that suggested craftsmanship from a culture far removed from Boston's industrial environment. But his eyes that commanded attention, dark, intelligent, and carrying an authority that made even Kelly's enforcers step back instinctively. "Who the hell are you?" Kelly demanded, his hand moving toward the gun concealed beneath his coat. "I am Kiviuq," the stranger replied in accented but precise English. "I represent certain trading interests in the Northern Territories."
I could not help but overhear your conversation, and I believe we might be able to reach a mutually beneficial arrangement. Kelly's eyes narrowed with suspicion. What kind of arrangement? Kiviuq reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. I am prepared to purchase the young woman's contract for the full amount of her father's debt, plus a substantial bonus for your inconvenience. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. This stranger was proposing to buy her, just as Kelly had suggested, but with the casual efficiency of someone purchasing livestock at a market. "Now wait just a minute," Kelly said, suddenly protective of what he saw as his territory. "Mickey's got first claim on any assets the debtor might have." "Of course," Kiviuq agreed smoothly, "which is why I'm offering to settle the debt in full with interest. Your employer receives his money immediately, with no risk of default or complications. Surely that's preferable to the uncertain value of alternative arrangements." Kelly considered the proposal, obviously calculating the advantages. A guaranteed payment was indeed preferable to the complications that might arise from trying to force a reluctant woman into service, especially when that woman was clearly intelligent enough to cause problems. "How much are we talking about?" Kelly asked. Kiviuq counted out gold coins onto the room's single table. $4,000, he said calmly. "The debt, plus interest, and enough extra to compensate for any inconvenience." The sum was more money than any of them had ever seen in one place. Kelly's eyes widened with greed, while Patrick stared at the coins with the desperate gratitude of a drowning man seeing a life preserver. "It's a deal," Kelly said quickly before anyone could reconsider. "The girl's yours." "Excellent," Kiviuq replied. He turned to Patrick with an expression of mild contempt. "I assume you have no objections to this arrangement." Patrick, faced with the choice between his daughter's freedom and his own survival, made the decision that Lydia would never forgive him for. "None at all," he said eagerly. "Lydia's a good girl. She'll serve you well." "I'm sure she will," Kiviuq said quietly, but his tone suggested that his definition of service might be very different from what the others assumed. The transaction was completed with shocking efficiency. Kelly collected the gold and departed with his men, satisfied that Mickey O'Sullivan's interests had been protected. Patrick, relieved to be alive and free of debt, began making plans for his next venture, already forgetting the daughter he had just sold. And Lydia found herself alone with a stranger who had just purchased her like a piece of furniture. "Gather your belongings," Kiviuq told her when the others had gone. "We leave within the hour." "Where are you taking me?" Lydia asked, her voice barely steady. "North," Kiviuq replied simply. "To a place where different laws apply, where different values govern how people treat each other." As Lydia packed her few possessions into a small traveling bag, she tried to process what had just happened to her. In the space of an hour,
She had gone from being a free woman to being someone's property, purchased like a horse or a piece of equipment. The stranger who had bought her seemed civil enough, but she had no illusions about what her fate would likely be in the northern wilderness, where no laws would protect her from whatever he might demand. The journey from Boston began immediately, with Kiviuq leading her to a waiting carriage that would take them to the harbor, where a ship was preparing to depart for the Canadian territories. During the ride, Lydia studied her new owner, trying to understand what kind of man he might be and what he might expect from her. Kiviuq was clearly someone of wealth and status, judging by the quality of his clothing and the respectful way the carriage driver and ship's crew treated him. But there was something about his manner that didn't match her expectations of what a man who bought women would be like. He spoke to her politely, asked if she needed food or water, and made no demands or threatening gestures. "What do you want from me?" Lydia finally asked as their ship pulled away from Boston Harbor. Kiviuq studied her for a long moment before answering. "I want you to understand that you are not what I purchased today." "I don't understand." "I purchased your father's debt, and the claim that debt gave others over your freedom," Kiviuq explained carefully. "But you yourself, your thoughts, your will, your essential self, these things cannot be bought or sold. They belong to you alone." Lydia stared at him in confusion. "But you paid for me. You own me now." "I own a piece of paper that says certain men will no longer threaten you or your father," Kiviuq corrected. "But I do not own you, because no person can own another person. This is a fundamental truth that my people understand, even if your society does not." The conversation was unlike anything Lydia had expected, and it left her unsure how to respond. She had been prepared for demands, threats, or worse. Instead, she was being given a philosophy lesson about the nature of human freedom. As their ship traveled north through increasingly rough seas, Kiviuq began to tell Lydia about his people and their way of life. He was the leader of an Inuit community in the Arctic territories, he explained, someone who had traveled south to negotiate trading agreements with European merchants and government officials. "My people have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years," he told her during one of their conversations on deck. "We have learned that survival in harsh conditions requires cooperation, not domination. A leader who treats his people like property will soon find himself leading no one at all." "But you bought me," Lydia pointed out.
How is that different from treating me like property? Because I bought you in order to free you from people who would have treated you like property, Kiviuq replied. There is a difference between rescuing someone from slavery and enslaving them yourself. Lydia wanted to believe what he was telling her, but years of hard experience had taught her to be skeptical of men's promises, especially when those men held power over her. She had seen too many women trust the wrong person and pay terrible prices for their naivety. But as the days passed and their ship traveled further north, Kiviuq's actions consistently matched his words. He treated her with respect, asked for her opinions on various matters, and made no demands on her time or attention beyond what courtesy required. When she was seasick, he brought her remedies and made sure she was comfortable. When she was cold, he provided additional blankets and warm clothing. "Why are you being kind to me?" Lydia asked one evening as they stood at the ship's rail, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. "Because kindness costs nothing and makes everything better," Kiviuq replied simply. "And because you deserve kindness, regardless of what your father's actions might suggest about your worth." The words hit Lydia harder than she had expected. For months, she had felt like a burden, a liability that had contributed to her father's problems rather than solving them. Hearing someone suggest that she had inherent worth, independent of her utility to others, was both healing and deeply moving. As their ship reached the Arctic territories and they transferred to smaller boats that could navigate the coastal waters, Lydia began to see the world that Kiviuq had described. The landscape was unlike anything she had ever imagined. Vast, austere,
and beautiful in ways that defied easy description. But more importantly, she began to meet the people who had shaped Kiviuq's understanding of leadership and community. The Inuit settlements they visited were organized around principles that were completely foreign to Lydia's Boston upbringing. Rather than strict hierarchies based on wealth or birthright, these communities operated on consensus and mutual respect. Leaders earned their positions through wisdom and service rather than inheritance or force, and every member of the community had a voice in important decisions. How can anything get done if everyone has to agree? Lydia asked Kiviuq after witnessing a lengthy community discussion about hunting strategies. Things get done because everyone understands they have a stake in the outcome. When people feel heard and valued, they work harder and complain less. When they feel ignored or exploited, they do only what they must to survive. It was a lesson in leadership that was completely opposite to everything Lydia had observed in Boston's industrial environment, where workers were treated as interchangeable parts in a larger machine and expected to follow orders without question or complaint.
But perhaps most striking to Lydia was the way women were treated in these Arctic communities. Unlike the limited roles available to women in Boston society, Inuit women held positions of real authority and respect. They were hunters, healers, storytellers, and advisors whose opinions carried weight in community decisions. In your culture, women are considered property of their fathers and then their husbands, Kiviuq observed as they watched a female elder mediating a dispute between two families. In ours, women are considered people with their own wisdom and strength. Which approach do you think produces stronger communities? The question forced Lydia to reconsider everything she had been taught about gender roles and social organization. The evidence before her eyes suggested that societies that valued women's contributions were more stable and prosperous than those that relegated them to purely domestic roles. Can you imagine discovering that everything you were taught about your place in the world was wrong, and that you actually had far more potential than anyone had ever allowed you to believe? As they reached Kiviuq's home community, Lydia felt both excitement and apprehension about what her new life would hold. She had been purchased like property, but she was beginning to understand that her purchaser had very different ideas about ownership and value than the men who had threatened her in Boston. The community that welcomed them was larger and more sophisticated than the smaller settlements they had visited during their journey. Built around the natural harbor that provided protection from Arctic storms, the village housed several hundred people in structures that combined traditional Inuit design with innovations that reflected contact with European technology and materials. But what struck Lydia most forcefully was the way the community received her. Rather than being introduced as Kiviuq's property or servant, she was presented as someone he had helped escape from difficult circumstances, someone who would contribute to the community's welfare while learning their ways and customs. "We understand that you come from a very different world," Nuka, one of the community elders, told Lydia through Kiviuq's translation. "But we believe that different perspectives make us stronger, not weaker. You will teach us about your people's ways, and we will teach you about ours." The approach was completely different from what Lydia had expected. Instead of being forced to abandon her previous identity and adopt entirely new customs, she was being invited to share her knowledge and experience while gradually learning new skills and perspectives. Over the following weeks, Lydia began to settle into a routine that felt more like education than servitude. She was given her own living space, a well-appointed room in a large community building that housed several families, and was introduced to various community members who taught her essential skills for Arctic survival. She learned to prepare traditional foods, to craft clothing from animal hides, to read weather patterns and ice conditions. But she also found opportunities to share her own knowledge, teaching community members to read and write English, sharing techniques for organizing supplies and managing resources that she had learned during her years of poverty in Boston. "You have valuable skills,"
Kiviuq told her one evening as they worked together to prepare lessons for a group of young people who were eager to learn about the outside world. Your education, your experience with different forms of organization, your understanding of how trade relationships work, these things are useful to us. Lydia was surprised to realize that she felt useful in ways she had never experienced before. In Boston, her work at the textile mill had been repetitive and meaningless, contributing to someone else's profit without giving her any sense of accomplishment or purpose. Here, her contributions were valued and appreciated, and she could see how her efforts made the community stronger and more prosperous. But perhaps more importantly, she was beginning to understand what Kiviuq had meant when he said that some things could not be owned. Despite the legal transaction that had brought her here, she was discovering that her mind, her will, and her essential identity remained entirely her own. No one expected her to surrender her thoughts or opinions, and no one demanded that she pretend to be grateful for circumstances she had not chosen. As autumn deepened into winter and the Arctic landscape transformed into a world of ice and snow, Lydia found herself settling into a life that was challenging but deeply satisfying. The physical demands of Arctic survival had made her stronger and more confident, while the intellectual stimulation of learning new skills and sharing her knowledge had given her a sense of purpose she had never experienced. But she was also becoming aware of her growing feelings for Kiviuq himself. The man who had purchased her freedom had revealed himself to be unlike anyone she had ever known. Intelligent, principled, and genuinely committed to creating a better world for the people under his leadership. Their working relationship had evolved into a friendship based on mutual respect and shared interests, and Lydia was beginning to hope it might become something more. The realization was both exciting and terrifying. Lydia had no experience with relationships that were based on genuine equality rather than economic necessity or social obligation. The idea that she might choose to love someone and be loved in return for reasons that had nothing to do with duty or survival was almost too wonderful to believe. The moment of truth came during the winter solstice celebration, when the entire community gathered to mark the longest night of the year and the gradual return of the sun. As part of the festivities, community members shared stories and songs that reflected their hopes for the coming year.
When Kiviuq was asked to speak, he rose and addressed the gathering in both Inuktitut and English, ensuring that Lydia could understand his words as well as his people. "This year has brought us many gifts," he said, his eyes finding Lydia's across the crowded room. "We have welcomed a new member to our community, someone who has enriched our understanding of the world beyond our borders. But more than that, we have been reminded that the greatest treasures are not things that can be bought or sold, but relationships that are freely chosen and carefully nurtured." The words were clearly directed at Lydia, and she felt her heart race as she understood their implications. Kiviuq was not just acknowledging her contributions to the community, he was expressing his own feelings about their relationship. After the formal celebration ended, Kiviuq approached Lydia as she helped clear away the remnants of the feast. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "Something I should have said weeks ago." "What is it?" Lydia asked, though she thought she might already know. "I have fallen in love with you," Kiviuq said simply. "Not because I purchased you, not because you owe me anything, but because of who you are and how you have chosen to build a life here among us." Lydia felt tears spring into her eyes, tears of relief, joy, and something approaching disbelief that such happiness was possible for someone like her. "I love you too," she admitted, "but I need to know, do you see me as an equal, or will I always be the woman you bought from her father's creditors?" Kiviuq took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "You were never a possession to be bought. You were a person in need of rescue, and I happen to be in a position to provide that rescue. What we build together from this point forward will be built on choice, not obligation." The conversation that followed was the most honest and important of Lydia's life. She and Kiviuq talked through the night about their hopes, their fears, and their understanding of what their relationship could become.
They discussed the challenges they would face as leaders of a community that was adapting to rapid change, the responsibilities they would share in preparing their people for an uncertain future. But most importantly, they talked about love, not the romantic fantasy that popular novels promoted, but the real daily work of building a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine commitment to each other's well-being. "I want to marry you," Kiviuq said as dawn began to break over the frozen landscape, "not because I own you, but because I choose you, and only if you choose me in return." "I do choose you," Lydia replied, her voice steady with certainty. "But I need to know, do you see me as an equal, or will I always be the woman you bought from her father's creditors?" Kiviuq took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "You were never a possession to be bought. You were a person in need of rescue, and I happen to be in a position to provide that rescue. What we build together from this point forward will be built on choice, not obligation. My people have always understood that the strongest families are those where both partners contribute their full strength and wisdom." The wedding that followed was a celebration that combined Inuit traditions with elements that honored Lydia's own cultural background. The entire community participated in festivities that lasted for days, acknowledging not just the union of two individuals, but the strengthening of bonds between different worlds and ways of life. As Lydia spoke her vows in both English and the Inuktitut she had been learning, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The gambling debt that had seemed like the end of her world had actually been the beginning of a life she could never have imagined. The father who had sold her to save himself had inadvertently given her the greatest gift possible, the chance to discover her own worth, her own strength, and her own capacity for love and leadership. The man who had purchased her had shown her what it meant to be truly valued, not for what she could provide, but for who she chose to be. Years later, as Lydia stood before the Arctic Ocean watching her children play in the snow, she often thought about that terrifying day in the Boston boarding house when her world had collapsed around her. The woman who had been sold like livestock to pay a gambling debt had become a respected leader in her own right, someone whose voice carried weight in community decisions and whose wisdom was sought by people throughout the region. Her marriage to Kiviuq had evolved into a true partnership, with both of them contributing their unique strengths to the challenge of leading their people through a period of unprecedented change. Lydia's understanding of the outside world, combined with Kiviuq's deep knowledge of traditional ways, had helped their community adapt to new realities while maintaining their essential identity and values. But the journey to this point had not been without its trials and setbacks. The first major challenge had come during their third year of marriage, when a dispute with neighboring communities threatened to escalate into serious conflict. A group of European traders had been playing different Inuit groups against each other, promising exclusive trading rights to whichever community could provide the most furs and ivory. The strategy was designed to maximize the traders' profits while keeping the indigenous communities too divided to negotiate effectively for fair prices. But it was also creating tensions that threatened to destroy relationships that had been maintained for generations. "We need to unite the communities," Lydia had argued during one of the heated discussions that preceded their response to the crisis. "If we allow ourselves to be turned against each other, we all lose. The traders win by dividing us." Her perspective, informed by her understanding of how business worked in the outside world, had been initially met with skepticism from some community members who preferred traditional approaches to such conflicts. But Kiviuq had supported her analysis, and together they had developed a strategy that brought together leaders from across the region. The negotiations that followed had been complex and difficult, requiring all of Lydia's diplomatic skills and Kiviuq's deep understanding of traditional protocols. But in the end, they had succeeded in creating a unified response that forced the traders to offer fair terms to all communities, rather than playing them against each other. "You saved us from making a terrible mistake," one of the other leaders had told Lydia after the negotiations concluded successfully. "Your understanding of how outsiders think was exactly what we needed." The incident had established Lydia's reputation as someone whose bicultural perspective provided valuable insights that purely traditional approaches might miss. But it had also taught her important lessons about the challenges of leadership in a rapidly changing world. Their children had been born into this complex environment, growing up with the understanding that they would need to navigate between multiple worlds and competing demands. Their eldest son, Tunu, had inherited Kiviuq's natural authority and Lydia's analytical mind, making him a natural diplomat who could communicate effectively with people from very different cultural backgrounds. Their daughter, Nayeli, had developed into a gifted storyteller and teacher whose ability to preserve traditional knowledge while making it accessible to younger generations had made her invaluable to the community's cultural preservation efforts. She had also shown remarkable skill in learning new languages, becoming fluent in English, French, and several other indigenous languages that expanded her ability to serve as a cultural interpreter. Their youngest son, Aput, had surprised everyone by developing into a skilled craftsman whose innovative approaches to traditional techniques had created new opportunities for trade and cultural exchange. His work combined traditional Inuit designs with techniques Lydia had taught him from her textile mill experience, producing unique pieces that were highly valued by collectors and traders throughout the region. The success of their children had been deeply gratifying to both Lydia and Kiviuq, but it had also brought new challenges as the young people reached adulthood and began making their own choices about how to balance traditional and modern influences in their lives. Tunu had chosen to spend several years traveling throughout the Arctic territories, learning from different communities and developing relationships that would serve him well when he eventually assumed leadership responsibilities. His absence had been difficult for the family, but his letters describing his experiences had provided valuable intelligence about changing conditions throughout the region. The government is becoming more aggressive about asserting control over indigenous territories, one of his letters had reported. Communities that don't adapt their leadership structures to deal with outside bureaucracies are finding themselves at serious disadvantages in negotiations over land rights and resource access. The warning had prompted Lydia and Kiviuq to begin developing new approaches to community governance that could interface effectively with government officials while maintaining traditional decision-making processes. It was delicate work that required careful balance between accommodation and resistance, between adaptation and preservation. Nayeli had faced different challenges as she grew into her role as a cultural preservationist and educator. The traditional knowledge she was working to preserve was being threatened not just by outside influences, but by the simple passage of time, as older community members died and younger ones became more interested in modern technologies and opportunities. How do we make traditional knowledge seem relevant to young people who are fascinated by radios and automobiles? She had asked her parents during one of their regular family discussions about community challenges. The question had no easy answers, but Lydia and Kiviuq had worked with Nayeli to develop innovative approaches that connected traditional knowledge to practical applications that young people could appreciate. They created programs that showed how traditional weather prediction methods were more accurate than modern techniques, how traditional food preservation methods were more nutritious than factory-processed alternatives, how traditional social structures provided better support systems than the individualistic approaches promoted by outside influences. Apat's challenges had been more personal than professional. As someone whose work bridged traditional and modern approaches, he sometimes struggled with questions about his own identity and place in the community. His innovations were appreciated and valued, but they also set him apart from his peers in ways that could be isolating. "Am I still truly Inuit if I'm using techniques from the outside world?" he had asked his parents during a particularly difficult period of self-doubt. "Or am I becoming something else entirely?" The question had resonated deeply with Lydia, who had struggled with similar identity issues during her own integration into Inuit society. She had learned that identity was not something fixed and unchanging, but something that could evolve and grow while still maintaining essential core values and connections. "You are who you choose to be," she had told Apat. "Your techniques may be new, but your purpose, serving your community and honoring your ancestors, remains the same. Innovation that serves good purposes is not betrayal, it's evolution." The conversation had helped Apat find peace with his unique position in the community, and his work had continued to flourish as he gained confidence in his ability to bridge different worlds without losing himself in the process. As the children grew into full adulthood and began establishing their own families, Lydia and Kiviuq found themselves transitioning into elder roles that focused more on guidance and wisdom sharing than day-to-day leadership.
The process had been both rewarding and challenging, requiring them to learn when to step back and allow younger voices to take the lead. It's hard to watch them make mistakes that we could help them avoid, Kiviuq had observed during one of their evening conversations about the community's future direction. But they need to make their own mistakes in order to develop their own wisdom, Lydia had replied, drawing on lessons she had learned from watching her own children grow and develop. Our job now is to be available when they need advice, not to impose our judgment on every decision they make. The wisdom of that approach had been demonstrated repeatedly as the next generation took on greater responsibilities and proved themselves capable of innovative solutions that their parents might not have considered. Tunu's diplomatic skills had proved invaluable in negotiations with government officials, while Nayeli's educational programs had successfully engaged young people who had been losing interest in traditional culture. Aput's craftsmanship had opened new economic opportunities that provided sustainable income for community members, while creating positive relationships with outside markets. His success had inspired other young people to explore ways of combining traditional skills with modern techniques, creating a renaissance of innovation that strengthened rather than threatened cultural preservation efforts. The grandchildren who began arriving as the years passed represented yet another evolution in the family's complex cultural legacy. These children grew up even more multicultural than their parents, with access to educational opportunities and technological resources that previous generations could never have imagined. But they also grew up with strong connections to traditional knowledge and values, thanks to the foundation that Lydia and Kiviuq had established, and their children had continued to build upon. The grandchildren learned traditional hunting and survival skills alongside modern academic subjects, traditional stories alongside contemporary literature, traditional ceremonies alongside modern civic responsibilities. They're growing up in a different world than we did, Lydia observed, as she watched her grandson demonstrate his ability to use both traditional navigation techniques and modern compass readings to find his way across the tundra. But they're still our people, still connected to the land and the ancestors in ways that matter. The comment reflected the peace Lydia had made with the constant changes that characterized life in the modern Arctic. Rather than seeing change as inherently threatening to traditional culture, she had learned to evaluate changes based on whether they served positive purposes and strengthened community bonds. Some changes were beneficial: improved medical care, better communication systems, access to educational opportunities that prepared young people for leadership roles in an interconnected world.
Other changes were harmful. Government policies that undermine traditional governance structures, economic pressures that force families to separate, cultural influences that promoted individualism over community responsibility. The key, Lydia had learned, was developing the wisdom to distinguish between helpful and harmful changes and the courage to embrace the former while resisting the latter. It was a complex balancing act that required constant attention and adjustment, but it was essential for maintaining cultural integrity while adapting to evolving circumstances. As Lydia entered her 70s, she often reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from a Boston boarding house to a position of respected leadership in the Arctic. The terrified young woman who had been sold to pay her father's gambling debts had evolved into someone whose voice was sought on important decisions affecting indigenous communities throughout the region. Government officials regularly consulted her on policy matters affecting Northern Territories, recognizing that her unique perspective provided insights that purely bureaucratic approaches might miss. Traders and business leaders valued her understanding of both traditional and modern economic systems, while academic researchers appreciated her ability to bridge different ways of understanding the world. But perhaps most importantly, she had become a symbol of hope for other women who found themselves trapped in circumstances beyond their control. Her story was told throughout the Arctic as proof that even the most desperate situations could be transformed through courage, wisdom, and the willingness to embrace unexpected opportunities. "Your father's death was the best thing that ever happened to you," Kiviuq joked during one of their conversations about their shared history. "Not the debt itself," Lydia had corrected with a smile, "but the way you chose to respond to it. You could have treated me like property, and no one would have questioned your right to do so. Instead, you showed me what freedom really meant. The distinction was important to Lydia because it highlighted the role of choice in creating positive outcomes from negative circumstances. Her transformation had not been inevitable. It had required specific decisions by specific people at crucial moments. Kiviuq could have chosen to exploit his purchase of her rather than honoring her humanity. She could have chosen to remain bitter about her father's betrayal rather than embracing new opportunities for growth and service. The community could have chosen to treat her as an outsider rather than welcoming her as a valuable addition to their collective wisdom and strength. Each of these choices had been essential to creating the positive outcome that had emerged from what initially appeared to be a devastating situation.
As winter settled over their Arctic home and the aurora borealis painted the sky in brilliant displays of natural beauty, Lydia often found herself thinking about Patrick Brennan, the father who had sold her to save himself from the consequences of his gambling addiction. She had never seen him again after that terrible day in Boston, and she had no idea whether he was still alive or what had become of his life after their separation. For many years, she had felt only anger and resentment toward the man who had been willing to sacrifice her freedom for his own survival. But time and wisdom had gradually transformed those feelings into something more complex, a mixture of sadness for the broken man he had become, gratitude for the unexpected journey his betrayal had initiated, and hope that he had somehow found his own path to redemption. "Do you think he ever regretted what he did?" Lydia had asked Kiviuq during one of their conversations about forgiveness and healing. "I think he regretted it every day for the rest of his life," Kiviuq had replied. "But I also think he was too proud and too ashamed to admit it, even to himself. Some people never learn how to accept responsibility for their mistakes, so they carry the weight of them forever." The observation had helped Lydia find peace with her father's memory, understanding that his actions had been driven by desperation and weakness, rather than malice or calculation. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it helped her see him as a broken human being rather than a monster, which made forgiveness possible even if reconciliation was not. The story of Lydia's transformation had become part of the community's cultural heritage, told and retold to successive generations as an illustration of important principles about human worth, the nature of freedom, and the power of love to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Children who heard the story learned that people could not be owned, that circumstances could be changed through courage and wisdom, that the most valuable things in life could not be bought or sold. But they also learned that transformation required active participation rather than passive acceptance, that positive outcomes had to be created through conscious choices rather than simply hoped for or expected. Lydia's story was inspiring not because she had been rescued, but because she had actively participated in her own rescue and had used her freedom to create something valuable for herself and her community. As she approached the end of her life, Lydia often marveled at the complexity of the legacy she and Kiviuq had created together.